But people kept on telling me to slow down, you know. I said, hey, slow down. I'm like, oh. You know, remember, less is more. And I always said, how can that be? How can less be more? It's impossible. More is more.
Dude, shut up, Yngwie J. Malmsteen, you wacky 80s neoclassical shred hair metal Swede, you. I actually always enjoyed that clip. I just think it's really funny. I'm not at all the biggest Yngwie J. Malmsteen fan in the world, but I have to admit that more is just his style, and I respect that. I have to admit, he's entertaining. But my point here is that Yngwie is wrong. He is dead wrong. Less can, in fact, be more. And Paul Kossoff, best known for playing guitar in the 60s British hard rock band Free, is my go-to demonstration of this. In this video, we're going to be looking at his playing, particularly the awesome instrumental track Time Away, from the album Backstreet Crawler, which he recorded after leaving Free, and we're going to talk about how less can indeed be more. So, Paul Kossoff played in the band Free from 1968 when he was just 17 years old till 1973. So, he was very young then. In fact, the whole band were very young. Andy Fraser, the bass player in the band, was 2 years younger still than Paul. Free are, of course, best known today for their hit song All Right Now. And also for starting the career of singer Paul Rodgers, who went on to find even greater success through the 70s in his hard rock band Bad Company, which he formed with the drummer from Free, Simon Kirke. For my money though, Free were the better band. They're more straightforward and modest than Led Zeppelin. They're less exploratory and kind of psychedelic than Cream. And I would actually go so far as to say they're my favourite British blues band of the late 60s or the early 70s. I maintain that All Right Now is still a great song in spite of how overplayed it might be, but there's also just so much more to them than that song. Check out their Fire and Water album from 1970. It's them at their peak. You've got great songs, great guitar playing, great singing, some really tasty bass work. It's just good stuff all around. And check out some of their live stuff as well. They do a particularly great version of the Robert Johnson song Crossroads, possibly even greater than Cream's. There, I said it. Now, Paul Kossoff wasn't as involved in free songwriting as Andy Fraser, a criminally underrated bass player himself, or Paul Rodgers, but his guitar playing was always central to their sound and their success. Everyone from Joe Bonamassa through Paul Weller and Angus Young are big fans of his playing and count him as an influence. Chunky riffs, a big fat Les Paul tone, and some of the best guitar solos in 60s rock. Some of the best solos, but also some of the simplest. Paul himself was the first to admit his limitations, saying that his style was primitive and limited, and it was. But he also took great pride in what made him stand out as a guitarist. He knew what his musical voice was, and he knew how to use it effectively in communicating emotions. Alongside that primitive style was a desire to put expression and maturity first. Listen to this guitar solo from a live performance of Fire and Water. He's really barely playing any notes, there's not much in there at all, but I love it. It's actually quite difficult to replicate that style, weirdly. It's hard to A, play with that much restraint, and B, earn that restraint. You need to squeeze every last bit of feeling out of every single note. His awesome vibrato was a huge part of this, and Eric Clapton even once famously asked him for tips on that. Paul's playing was always what I would call modest. Sure, there was the occasional moment where he'd get a little bit flashy, but never massively. This video though isn't about arguing that his playing was great in spite of that simplicity, but instead because of that simplicity. I'm not sure if any guitarist before or since has played with such concision, such economy as Paul Kossoff. There isn't a single wasted note or articulation in his playing. Every bend, every vibrato wiggle, and every slide is used to maximum effect. Basically, he says a lot with very little. But in what way does music say something? So anyone who's watched any of my videos will know that I love a good food analogy. I use them a lot. Today though, the analogy is with language. In fact, it's Probably a bit more than analogy, it's more of a metaphor or a model. So here we go. Music is a language, not in the same way that English or French is, but it is a language all the same. All of us actually have a range of languages that we use to communicate with each other. Some of these languages express feelings and thoughts implicitly, like body language, and others we use maybe to describe abstract relationships between things, like, say, maths. When we start to understand music as a language as well as an art form, we really begin to understand it. Like verbal language, let's say English, music has a vocabulary. It has dialects, accents, tone, dynamics. It can be written or digitized and transmitted across great distances, but it is still primarily, in the first instance, something that we hear. So this point is important. Music has a vocabulary or a set of vocabularies. For example, rock music's vocabulary is mostly kind of blues-based with a dash of folk, some classical influences, and a few decades of independent development in its own direction. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but only a little bit. Jazz vocabulary is its own thing as well, as is country, as is Balkan folk. All these genres share something in common, but there are also loads of differences. Just like verbal languages, which can be split into Germanic, Romance, and Slavic languages. Different genres sound different because they have these different vocabularies. You won't often hear a jazz guitarist play something like this. And if I play this, well, there's a good chance that your brain will automatically register it as vaguely Spanish sounding. You don't need to know much about music to pick up on that, just like you don't need to know any French to know that someone might be speaking French. In music, vocabularies are a combination of three things. You have melody, the notes you play, harmony, the notes you play together, and rhythm, the timing of the notes and sounds. Paul Kossoff's melodic vocabulary is the essence of simplicity, pretty standard rock licks. It's mostly pentatonic with the odd kind of Dorian or Mixolydian lick thrown in. He does a lot of that kind of typical bluesy major mining mixing thing as well. Nice stuff, but as I say, very simple. In Time Away, he is solely playing minor pentatonic with the occasional ninth added in. We're in the key of D minor, so that means he plays the notes D, E, F, G, A, and C. The track, as it appears on the album, is actually part of a longer 38-minute long jam, recorded with the folk guitarist John Martin. Across the entire jam, he does actually play a bit of Dorian, adding in the B note at points. But those bits are edited down for the final version. Go to Spotify if you really want to hear the entire thing. But honestly, you'll find the best bits in the edited down version anyway, so just check that out. Harmonically, pretty much the same story. Paul just sticks to power chords and bar chords most of the time, some open chords, and he would occasionally double up guitar parts, playing two different voicings simultaneously on two different tracks to really thicken the sound for his riffs. But there's nothing really beyond that. I don't even really hear many particularly out there blues progressions in his playing. It's just basic blues rock stuff, really. Time Away is no exception. It's basically just a blues in D minor. So we've got D minor and G minor and like the occasional A minor, but it only really gets played as a passing chord. The overall structure then is just D minor to G minor. These chords are mostly played as seventh chords and it's John Martin in the background playing the rhythm parts. He's mostly just staying out of the way and letting Paul take charge with his lead playing. The chord progression then is as simple as they come and it just kind of goes around and around. It doesn't necessarily take us anywhere, but it gives the playing the structure it needs harmonically. Rhythmically, again, very simple stuff. He tends to either play straight 4/4 or a bit swung. He's not messing around with polymeters, weird time signatures, or tuplets or anything like that. At the risk of repeating myself, it's simplicity incarnate. This track, Time Away, is just a nice slow blues rock, around 60 beats per minute in 4/4, and he plays the odd triplet lick, but nothing really beyond that. So, what's the point? What am I getting at? Honestly, sometimes I don't even know. The broader point that I'm making, though, is threefold. So, one, there are some things that can only be communicated with more advanced or specialized vocabulary. I can read, for example, a popular science book about quantum physics, and on some level get it, right? But that's a very surface level understanding. I need maths to really begin to understand it, and at the very least, I need some specialized vocabulary beyond what I use in my day-to-day life. Some other things don't need a very specialized vocabulary at all to be communicated, but it could go either way. Most art falls into this category. We could say, oh look, isn't that a beautiful flower? Which is fine. Or we could write a poem about it, as many people have done, or a song.
No shades bright as the flowers of the forest.
Or paint it, or even make a computer game about it. There's a range of approaches we could take, and none of them are really inherently better than any other. And three, there are those things, or maybe they're the same things as before but in a different context, that benefit from being communicated in much simpler vocabulary. For example, if we take a really straightforward sentiment, like saying, I love you, to your partner, it's not necessarily better to say it in a more erudite way. It can be, after all, lots of poetry, literature, lots of songs have been written to say precisely that. But sometimes saying anything more than those three words actually detracts from the sentiment. Sometimes, and this is the kind of crux of it, right? Sometimes being too sophisticated in expressing something makes it more about the person expressing it and more about the expressing of it than just about saying the thing. Am I being clear at all? I do wonder sometimes, but basically, sometimes just saying the thing is enough, and going on and on about it just hogs the limelight, right? Imagine this. It's 7 a.m, you're setting off for work, your partner is just up and making themselves breakfast. You say, see you later, love you. And then they go off on this long-winded, impromptu, but admittedly very eloquent rhapsody, describing your beauty, your grace, your charms. They compare you to all sorts of beautiful flowers or classical figures. Ooh, yeesh. I mean, that would be too much, right? At 7 a.m? Actually, that would potentially be a bit much for most people at any time. That sort of communication just wouldn't be appreciated. Partly because it would feel overwrought, partly because after a certain point it would be more about your partner showing off how articulate and smart they are than it would be about you or their feelings for you. What they're saying is overshadowed by how they are saying it. I am, of course, being a little bit silly here, but the basic same idea holds true for music or any language. There's a time and a place for sophistication and ambiguity and complexity, but there's also a time and a place for just saying what you think and being straightforward. So step in Paul Kossoff. Listening to Paul's guitar playing, you feel what he feels, completely shorn of any artifice or sense of showing off. It's modest, it's direct, it's pure. We might call it blunt, but that to me suggests a certain type of harshness. Now, his playing can be harsh. After all, he is a rock guitarist, but that's not really what I'm trying to say. It's just upfront. So if we take the title of this track into consideration, it's hard not to assume that Time Away is about missing someone or someplace. There's not much to go on, but listening to the music itself, there's definitely that sense of mourning or sadness, maybe even listlessness. It's that sort of family of emotions. So this is sort of where the whole language model gets a little bit complicated and maybe even falls apart slightly. Music, as in without the lyrics part of it, you know, the melody, the harmony and stuff, music doesn't really have content or meaning in the way that words do. Up, down, hello, yes, no, blue, orange. These words all have meanings that can be specifically understood by people who speak English. Even when they have multiple meanings, the context will make it pretty clear what is meant. But this... well, that doesn't mean anything. I can't give you directions by playing guitar. I don't think that's possible. Anyway, whatever context you place a piece of music in, it doesn't have literal meaning in the way that, say, English does. But music, in this case guitar playing, is still saying something. You can still get something from it. So that was me playing guitar there, and even if you don't like my guitar playing, you can still interpret the playing and understand that it's trying to do something emotional, right? Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear Paul Kossoff playing Time Away, I definitely do feel that he's saying something. It's hard to pin down and put it into words precisely, but that is the exact point of music and art generally. It's less good at communicating concrete ideas, but great at communicating feelings and sensations and whatnot. I can't put that all into words, but if I could, well then what would be the point of the song, right? Let's look at a few more specific things though. So a big cornerstone of Paul's guitar playing is space. He leaves a lot of it. Pauses, there are long sustained guitar notes, there are volume swells, he comes in off the beat or in the middle of a bar. This is all about timing. And just like timing with the spoken word, it's a very personal thing and hard to pin down. I'm sure we've all heard an otherwise quite good joke ruined by poor timing.
Holy shit, you're late.
She was late.
Go back in your life.
We've all watched a poorly made film where the drama of the moment is ruined by too long or too short of a pause and a bit of dialogue.
I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
And then there are just some people who have maybe a better or a worse sense of conversational timing than others, and most of us can recognize this, but it's not something you can really learn strict rules for. It's the same with guitar playing. Listen for the amount of space that Paul leaves in his playing on this track. Listening to this track and paying attention to Paul's approach really reminds me of one of the best pieces of guitar playing advice I ever heard. Think about your playing as a human voice, leaving time to breathe in and out. And pay attention to the kind of rhythms and cadences you might hear in the spoken word. When you're talking, you're not just saying a bunch of words at someone, you're pausing, you're umming and eyeing, you're waiting for them to reply. Some words you emphasize, others you de-emphasize, and sometimes you draw a syllable out for dramatic effect. There are loads of non-verbal articulations that you can add to your voice, and Paul is doing the exact same thing with his guitar playing. You can actually hear, if you listen very closely to the track, these little string touches, finger slides, and random noises in his playing that are picked up due to his high gain, high volume playing. This is just like all those little mistakes or idiosyncrasies in our speech. The key thing here then is that 1 or 2 words with the right tone of voice and at the right moment are worth 20 words. In fact, no, 1,000,000 words could not make up for the wrong tone of voice or poor timing. Getting that stuff right completely changes the impact of words, and the same is true in music. A rhythmically complex, harmonically sophisticated guitar solo can, of course, be super cool, but it's not just straightforwardly better, it's different. So I think most guitar players would agree that Paul Kossoff is in many ways at the extreme end of simplicity, but most rock guitarists have similarly limited vocabularies when it comes to it. David Gilmour, Jimmy Page, Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend, Eric Clapton, they are all great, but none of these guys have truly sophisticated harmonic, melodic, or rhythmic vocabularies. And in particular, when compared alongside jazz guitarists, the differences become stark. There are exceptions. Once you get to someone like Jeff Beck, things start to get a little bit more complex, and even more so through Gary Moore, Richie Blackmore, Steve Vai. And then once you progress through all of those, you get to someone like Guthrie Govan, who I guess is generally still rock, but has this encyclopedic musical vocabulary and clearly can play any style pretty easily. What great rock guitarists can do really well though, even with those more limited vocabularies, is these 2 things. A, communicate with conceptual clarity and direction. They're saying something, they're saying it clearly, and they're saying it directly. And B, they communicate with dynamism and expression. This second point is super important in rock. We all know that rock guitarists obsess over their tone, and it's primarily in rock guitar playing that you will hear bends, vibrato, volume swells, effects like wah-wah, phaser, distortion. You hear these in other genres as well, but it's much more prevalent in rock. Just like every human has their own way of talking, their own tone of voice and their own accent and rhythm, rock guitarists have an unusually wide array of these sorts of tools compared to other guitarists in other genres. Listen to the tone that Paul Kossoff is playing with on Time Away. It's just beautiful. Thick, buttery, constantly on the verge of feedback and occasionally just slipping into it. The tone really lifts the entire track to the next level, doesn't it? I could play some of the licks he plays, but with a sort of clean, straightforward tone. It's okay, but it's not great. If I get closer to that tone, that's much better. And a bit closer still, well, now it's actually coming alive, right? And coming alive really is the best way to say it. Paul's guitar sounds like some kind of wild animal, like wounded or distraught or something. It's almost like a banshee at points. The guitar is talking to us, not with words, but it's still communicating effectively. So really, it all comes down to two things for every musician. What are they saying and how are they saying it? Every musician has their own approach, their own voice, and every listener is going to come to it with a different set of expectations and preferences. And just to be clear, I am not at all putting simplicity on a pedestal. Less is not always more. Anyone who has seen other videos of mine will know that I like plenty of complicated music. And if anything, I probably tend to be more into the complex side than the straightforward side of things. The point is just that there's a time and a place for everything. As I said before, some things are best communicated in a sophisticated way, some things simply. And for other things, well, either works. Anyway, in spite of a great career start in free and in spite of all his potential, Paul's career never really took off. His life was cut tragically short in 1976 when he died of a pulmonary embolism on a plane from LA to New York. A blood clot in his leg moved into his lungs and it killed him. He was only 25 years old and he had been struggling with drug addiction for a long time by that point. His friend and bandmate Paul Rodgers said that he was simply too sensitive for this world, and Free's drummer Simon Kirke had long said that he thought the guitarist had a strong predisposition towards substance abuse, even from when they were teenagers. It's kind of sad to end on that note, but Paul's story really is just a sad one. Drugs, insecurity, ill health. It sucks, but these things happen. They happen to a lot of musicians and lots of people generally. At least he managed to find his unique and expressive voice on the guitar before he did die. Given how modest he was, he may not have realised himself how much of an impact he had on other guitar players, but he left behind some of my personal favourite blues rock guitar playing. Do yourself a favour and go check it out.